"You have 6 months to live, Mrs. Hawthorne." Dr. Pemberton's words hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest, but I maintained the composure that 72 years of life had taught me was essential during moments of crisis. I sat in his sterile office, surrounded by medical diplomas and motivational posters about wellness, absorbing the news that pancreatic cancer was apparently going to end my life before Christmas. 6 months, I repeated, testing how the words felt in my mouth. "Well, that's rather inconvenient. I had plans to redecorate the guest bathroom in spring." Dr. Pemberton looked at me with the mixture of sympathy and professional detachment that I supposed he'd perfected after delivering countless death sentences to unsuspecting patients who'd come in for routine checkups. "Mrs. Hawthorne, I know this is shocking news. We'll want to discuss treatment options, pain management, and quality of life considerations. I can recommend an excellent oncologist who specializes in palliative care." I barely heard the rest of his medical recommendations as my mind raced through the practical implications of my approaching demise. Who would inherit my 3 properties? My collection of vintage jewelry? The investment portfolio that had grown substantially since my husband Edgar's death 5 years ago? Most importantly, how would my 3 children, Jasper, Cordelia, and Felix, handle the news that their mother's days were numbered? I drove home from Dr. Pemberton's office in a daze, wondering how to break the news to my family. My children had been moderately attentive since Edgar's passing, visiting for obligatory holidays and calling with reasonable frequency to check on my well-being. They were good children, I told myself. They'd rally around me during this difficult time, providing emotional support and helping me navigate the complexities of terminal illness. How spectacularly wrong I was about their character would become apparent within days. I called Jasper first, reaching him at his accounting firm where he managed tax preparations for small businesses. "Jasper, dear, I need to share some difficult news with you. I've just come from Dr. Pemberton's office, and I'm afraid the diagnosis is quite serious." "What kind of diagnosis, Mother?" "Pancreatic cancer, terminal, 6 months, possibly less." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly 10 seconds before Jasper responded with what I initially interpreted as shock-induced speechlessness. 6 months? Are you certain about the timeline?" Dr. Pemberton seemed quite confident about his assessment. "Jasper, I wanted you to know immediately so we could discuss arrangements and—" "Mother, I'm in the middle of tax season. This is obviously devastating news, but can we discuss the details this weekend? I'm completely swamped with client deadlines." I felt taken aback by his business-like response, but attributed it to his methodical personality and the shock of receiving such terrible news about his mother's health. My calls to Cordelia and Felix followed similar patterns. Cordelia expressed appropriate concern, but explained that her interior design business was experiencing a particularly busy period, with several high-profile clients demanding immediate attention. Felix offered condolences, but mentioned that his restaurant was opening a second location and required his complete focus during the next few weeks. Within 3 days, I noticed a dramatic change in my children's behavior. Their daily check-in phone calls, which had been regular since Edgar's death, stopped entirely. When I called them, they answered with distracted impatience and found reasons to end conversations quickly. "I'm sure you understand, Mother, that this is a very difficult situation for all of us to process," Cordelia explained when I asked why she hadn't visited since learning about my diagnosis. "Sometimes people need space to handle overwhelming news. But on Friday evening, exactly 1 week after my devastating diagnosis, I discovered the real reason for my children's sudden emotional distance. I was watering my front garden when I heard voices coming from Jasper's car, which was parked in my driveway, while he and his siblings met inside my house to discuss practical arrangements. I crept closer to the living room window and listened to a conversation that shattered every illusion I'd maintained about my children's character and motivations. "The jewelry alone is worth at least $200,000, Cordelia was saying. "The vintage Cartier pieces that belonged to great-grandmother, plus all the estate jewelry Mother collected over the years. We need to be strategic about the property division," Jasper replied, with the calculating tone he used for complex tax planning. "The main house is worth $800,000, the lake cottage is worth $400,000, and the downtown rental property is worth $300,000. Don't forget about her investment portfolio," Felix added. "Mother mentioned it's worth over $1 million, plus there's the life insurance policy Dad left her." I stood frozen outside my own living room window, listening to my children discuss my assets with the enthusiasm of vultures circling fresh roadkill. They weren't grieving their mother's terminal diagnosis. They were celebrating their upcoming inheritance. The important thing is that we handle this division equitably, Cordelia continued. I think the jewelry should be distributed based on sentimental value rather than monetary worth. By sentimental value, you mean you want the most expensive pieces because you're the only daughter? Jasper asked with obvious skepticism. I'm saying that jewelry naturally passes from mothers to daughters and that Felix and you should focus on the real estate and investment assets. That's convenient reasoning, Cordelia. But jewelry is just another asset that should be divided equally among all three beneficiaries. As I listened to my children bicker about my possessions as if I were already dead and buried, I felt something shift inside my chest. Not the cancer that Dr. Pemberton had diagnosed, but a cold anger that crystallized into determination. These people had stopped seeing me as their living mother the moment they learned about my terminal diagnosis. I had become nothing more than an inconvenient obstacle standing between them and their inheritance, someone to be tolerated with false sympathy until I had the decency to die and transfer my wealth to them. The next morning, my phone rang while I was drinking coffee and contemplating how to handle the devastating revelation about my children's true character. Mrs. Hawthorne, this is Dr. Pemberton calling with urgent news about your test results. Dr. Pemberton? Has something changed about my prognosis? Mrs. Hawthorne, I'm calling to inform you of a terrible mistake in our laboratory. Your test results were accidentally switched with another patient's results. The pancreatic cancer diagnosis was incorrect. You're completely healthy. I sat in stunned silence, absorbing the news that I wasn't dying after all, that the terminal diagnosis that had upended my understanding of my remaining time on Earth had been a medical error. Mrs. Hawthorne, are you still there? Yes, Dr. Pemberton. I'm here. And I'm healthy? Completely healthy. Your actual test results show normal function across all systems. I cannot apologize enough for the error and the distress this mistake has caused you and your family. After ending the call, I sat in my kitchen staring at my coffee cup and thinking about my children's conversation from the previous evening. They believed I had 6 months to live, and their response had been to calculate the value of my possessions and plan their inheritance distribution. That's when I made a decision that would change our family dynamics forever. I was not going to tell them about the medical error. I was going to spend the next 6 months observing exactly how my children behaved when they believed their mother was dying, documenting their true character when they thought no one would be around to remember their choices. And then, in the 7th month, I was going to give them the surprise of their lifetimes. Some mothers get to learn what kind of people their children really are when they think no one is watching. I was about to become one of those mothers, and my children had no idea what was coming. The beauty of having a supposedly terminal diagnosis, I discovered, was that people stopped questioning my behavior when I acted a little strangely. If Beatrice Hawthorne wanted to spend her remaining months doing peculiar things, well, that was just the eccentricity of a dying woman trying to find meaning in her final days, which made it perfect cover for implementing what I had privately begun calling Operation Last Laugh. My first order of business was hiring Winston Blackwood, a private investigator who specialized in family matters and had been recommended by my attorney. Winston was a distinguished gentleman in his 60s who understood the importance of discretion and had experience documenting family dynamics during inheritance disputes. Mrs. Hawthorne, if I understand correctly, you want me to observe and record your children's behavior while they believe you're terminally ill, Winston said during our clandestine meeting at a coffee shop across town. Precisely. I need documented evidence of their conversations, their actions, and their priorities during what they believe are my final months. Winston, I suspect their behavior will become increasingly revealing as time passes. And you want this documentation for legal purposes? I want it for justice purposes. My children have shown me who they really are when they think I'm not long for this world. I intend to show them who I really am when they discover I'll be around for many more years. Phase 1 of my plan began immediately. I called each of my children to inform them that I'd been reflecting on my mortality and had decided to update my will to ensure my final wishes were clearly documented. Mother, you don't need to worry about legal arrangements right now. Jasper said when I mentioned my estate planning concerns. You should focus on your health and spending time with family. But darling, I want to make sure everything is in order. I've been thinking about distributing some of my possessions while I'm still alive to see people enjoy them. I could practically hear Jasper's alarm through the phone. Mother, that seems premature. You might need those resources for medical expenses or care. Nonsense, dear. The doctor said I have 6 months, not 6 days. I have time to be thoughtful about my legacy. What Jasper didn't know was that I was already being extraordinarily thoughtful about my legacy, just not in the way he anticipated. That weekend, I arranged for each of my children to visit separately, under the pretense of needing help with organizing my affairs. What I actually wanted was the opportunity to leave strategically placed documents where they could accidentally discover them. When Jasper arrived on Saturday morning, I sent him to my study to retrieve insurance paperwork from my desk drawer. What he found instead was a handwritten draft of a will, leaving my entire estate to him, with small token amounts for Cordelia and Felix. I watched from the hallway as Jasper photographed the document with his phone before carefully replacing it exactly where he'd found it. His face carried the satisfied expression of someone who'd just learned he'd won the inheritance lottery. On Sunday, Cordelia came to help me organize my jewelry collection for proper storage. While she was examining my vintage pieces, I excused myself to answer a fictitious phone call, giving her the opportunity to discover a different handwritten will draft that left the majority of my assets to her. Cordelia's reaction was even more dramatic than Jasper's. She actually squealed with delight before remembering to look appropriately solemn about her dying mother's estate planning. Felix's visit on Monday followed the same pattern. While he helped me review my investment portfolio, he discovered a third will draft, naming him as primary beneficiary. By Tuesday, Winston called to report that all 3 children had contacted attorneys about estate law and inheritance tax implications. Mrs. Hawthorne, your eldest son Jasper has scheduled 3 consultations with estate planning lawyers this week. Your daughter Cordelia has been researching jewelry appraisals and auction houses. And Felix has contacted a real estate agent about property valuations. Excellent. Phase 2 can begin. Phase 2 involved introducing my children to my new friend, Reginald Worthington, a charming gentleman I'd met through volunteer work at the hospital. What my children didn't know was that Reginald was actually an actor Winston had hired to play the role of a wealthy widower who was very interested in purchasing my properties. Children, I'd like you to meet Reginald, I announced during our family dinner on Wednesday evening. He's been such wonderful company during these difficult times, and he's helped me think about different ways to handle my financial affairs. Reginald played his part beautifully, explaining to my children that he was looking for investment properties in our area, and that their dear mother had mentioned possibly selling her real estate holdings to simplify her estate before her passing. Of course, I would only consider such arrangements if they brought peace of mind to dear Beatrice during her remaining time, Reginald said with practiced sincerity. The look of pure panic on my children's faces was absolutely priceless. Jasper actually choked on his wine when Reginald mentioned his interest in purchasing the downtown rental property for above-market value. Mother, surely you're not seriously considering selling property during such a stressful time, Cordelia interjected with forced casualness. Why not, dear? Reginald has offered excellent prices, and I thought it might be nice to simplify things for you children. Less complicated inheritance arrangements to sort through after I'm gone. But Mother, those properties have sentimental value, Felix protested. They're part of our family legacy. I nearly burst into laughter hearing Felix describe rental properties as family legacy when he'd never shown the slightest interest in my real estate investments during his entire adult life. Well, perhaps I should think about it more carefully, I said thoughtfully. Reginald, would you mind if I consulted with my children before making any final decisions? Of course, my dear Beatrice. Family consultation is essential for such important matters. After Reginald left, my children stayed for an emergency family meeting that I observed through my kitchen security camera, which Winston had helped me position to record their conversation. We cannot let Mother sell those properties to some random man she just met, Cordelia said with obvious agitation. Agreed. We need to convince her that hasty financial decisions aren't appropriate during terminal illness, Jasper added. What if we offered to help manage her affairs? You know, to reduce her stress and ensure she doesn't make choices she might regret, Felix suggested. I watched my children strategize about protecting their inheritance from their dying mother's poor judgment, and I felt absolutely delighted by how perfectly my plan was working. Some people believed that revenge was a dish best served cold. I was discovering that revenge was a dish best served with elaborate theatrical productions that exposed people's true character while entertaining the chef. Phase 3 was going to be even more fun. Phase 3 of Operation Last Laugh required me to channel my inner actress more dramatically than I'd ever done before. I'd always been told I had a flair for the theatrical. Edgar used to say I could have been on the stage if I'd been born in a different era. Little did he know his wife would one day use those talents to orchestrate the most elaborate family drama of the century. The centerpiece of Phase 3 was what I had privately dubbed the Great Charity Auction Panic. I spent an entire week crafting the perfect announcement to send my children into a tailspin of greed-induced hysteria. On Monday morning, I called each of them with breathless excitement about my wonderful new plan. "Darling, I've had the most marvelous inspiration," I told Jasper during my first call. "I've decided to host a charity auction right here at the house. I want to sell most of my possessions and donate the proceeds to various worthy causes. Wouldn't that be a lovely way to spend my remaining time?" The silence on Jasper's end was so complete, I wondered if the call had been disconnected. "Mother, a charity auction? With your personal belongings?" "Yes. My jewelry, artwork, antiques, even some of the furniture. I've already contacted Pemberton's auction house, and they're thrilled to organize everything. We're thinking next Saturday would be perfect." "Next Saturday? Mother, that seems quite sudden. Are you certain you've thought this through carefully?" "Oh, absolutely. I realized that watching people bid on my treasures would bring me much more joy than knowing they'll just sit in storage after I'm gone. This way, I can see them bring happiness to others while supporting charitable causes." I could practically hear Jasper's mental calculations grinding away as he processed the reality that his carefully anticipated inheritance was about to be auctioned off to strangers. My calls to Cordelia and Felix followed similar patterns, each conversation ending with promises to think about attending the auction with supportive enthusiasm that fooled absolutely no one. What my children didn't know was that Winston had positioned himself as Charles Pemberton from the fictional auction house, and that we were documenting every desperate attempt they would make to sabotage my charitable generosity. The beauty of the charity auction plan was watching my children try to talk me out of donating my possessions without appearing to be greedy vultures circling my deathbed. It required them to perform concern for my well-being while actually protecting their financial interests. "Mother, I'm worried that organizing such a large event might be too stressful during your treatment," Cordelia said when she visited on Tuesday to discuss the auction plans. "Nonsense, dear. I feel energized by the idea of doing something meaningful with my remaining time. But have you considered that some of these pieces have significant sentimental value? Great-grandmother's jewelry, for instance? Wouldn't you want those pieces to stay in the family?" "Cordelia, sentiment doesn't keep people warm at night or feed hungry children. The Cartier necklace alone could fund a scholarship program." I watched Cordelia's face turn pale at the mention of auctioning the Cartier pieces, which she'd been coveting since her teenage years. "Perhaps we could compromise," she suggested with forced brightness. "You could auction some pieces and keep the most meaningful ones to pass down to family members. But darling, that defeats the purpose. I want to give everything away so I can see the joy it brings to others." Felix's approach was more direct when he visited on Wednesday evening. "Mom, I've been thinking about your auction idea, and I'm concerned about the legal implications," he said with his most serious business expression. "What if there are tax consequences you haven't considered? What if the auction house doesn't get fair market value for your pieces?" "Felix, dear, I appreciate your concern, but I've already consulted with my attorney and accountant. Everything is perfectly legal and properly structured. But Mom, some of these pieces might be worth more as a collection than individually. You could be losing significant value by auctioning them separately. Felix, value is relative. The value I'll receive from seeing scholarship recipients succeed is worth more to me than maximizing auction proceeds." By Thursday, Winston reported that all 3 children had contacted the fictional Pemberton's auction house to discuss their mother's auction plans and had attempted to convince Charles Pemberton to postpone the event until their mother was thinking more clearly. "Mrs. Hawthorne, They've also been researching ways to challenge the legal capacity of terminally ill patients to make major financial decisions, Winston informed me with obvious amusement. Perfect. That means we're ready for Phase 4. Phase 4 involved the introduction of my new live-in caregiver, a role filled by Winston's business partner, a delightful woman named Violet Pennyworth, who specialized in undercover family investigations. Children, I'd like you to meet Violet, I announced during our Friday evening dinner. She's going to be staying with me to help manage my daily needs and ensure I'm taking proper care of myself. Violet played her part beautifully, presenting herself as a no-nonsense healthcare professional who was deeply concerned about my emotional well-being and my tendency to make impulsive charitable decisions. Your mother's generosity is admirable, Violet told my children with practiced concern, but I worry that terminal patients sometimes make financial choices that don't reflect their true long-term wishes. I watched my children practically salivate as Violet positioned herself as an ally in their campaign to protect my assets from my own charitable impulses. We share your concerns, Violet, Jasper said earnestly. We want to support Mother's wishes while ensuring she doesn't make decisions she might regret. Perhaps we could work together to help Mother think through these choices more carefully, Cordelia suggested. I think that would be very wise, Violet replied. Family input is essential for patients facing terminal diagnoses. What my children didn't realize was that Violet's real job was to document every conversation they had about managing my impaired judgment and protecting their inheritance from my irrational generosity. That weekend, I canceled the charity auction, explaining to my children that Violet had helped me understand the wisdom of more thoughtful estate planning. The relief on their faces was so obvious, I had to excuse myself to the bathroom to avoid laughing out loud. Thank goodness you've decided to reconsider, Mother, Felix said with transparent satisfaction. We were all worried you were rushing into decisions that might not reflect your true wishes. Some children thought they were protecting their inheritance from their mother's poor judgment. My children had no idea they were being protected from discovering how poor their own judgment really was. But they would learn soon enough. Phase 5 was going to be absolutely delicious. Phase 5 required me to tap into my most creative theatrical instincts because I was about to convince my children that their dying mother had completely lost her grip on reality. The plan was deliciously simple. I would begin losing valuable items around the house and making cryptic references to hiding treasures in secret locations. The inspiration came from a mystery novel I'd been reading about buried pirate treasure, which gave me the brilliant idea of convincing my children that I had become obsessed with securing my valuables in safe hiding places before my death. On Monday morning, I called Jasper in a state of apparent confusion and distress. Jasper, dear, I can't find great-grandmother's ruby brooch anywhere. I'm certain I put it somewhere safe, but my memory seems to be playing tricks on me. Mother, when did you last see the brooch? Yesterday evening, I think. Or perhaps it was last week. Jasper, I've been having the strangest dreams about hiding precious things in the garden. Do you suppose the medication is affecting my thinking? I could practically hear Jasper's mental alarms going off as he processed the possibility that his terminally ill mother was becoming mentally incompetent and losing track of valuable jewelry. Mother, perhaps you should make a list of where you've placed important items, just to help keep track of everything. What a sensible suggestion. But Jasper, some things shouldn't be written down. Some treasures need to be hidden in places only I would remember. Hidden treasures, Mother? Oh yes, dear. Your father and I used to play games about where we'd hide valuables if we ever needed to protect them from people who might not appreciate their true worth. That evening, I called Cordelia with a similar story about missing jewelry, adding elaborate details about secure locations and secret family hiding places that Edgar had supposedly shown me over the years. Mother, are you saying that Father hid valuables around the property? Perhaps, darling. He was always so clever about security. He said that banks weren't the only safe places for precious things. He said that sometimes the safest place was somewhere no one would think to look. Where did Father think people should look, Mother? Well, I can't tell you over the phone, can I? Phones aren't secure. But Cordelia, if something happens to my memory, you might want to remember that your father believed in the wisdom of the earth. The wisdom of the earth? He always said that what comes from the earth returns to the earth, but that wise people know how to retrieve what they've entrusted to the ground. By Wednesday, Winston reported that my children had begun conducting casual visits to inspect my garden and property for signs of recently disturbed soil or potential hiding places. Mrs. Hawthorne, your son Felix spent 2 hours yesterday examining your rose garden with what appeared to be a metal detector app on his phone. A metal detector app? How wonderfully modern! What did he tell me he was doing? He claimed he was helping you look for the ruby brooch that you said might have fallen outside while you were gardening. The beauty of Phase 5 was watching my children try to balance their growing desperation to find hidden treasures with their need to maintain the appearance of caring for their confused, dying mother. On Thursday evening, I escalated the treasure hunt by staging my most dramatic performance yet. I called all 3 children for an emergency family meeting, explaining that I was having clarity moments between periods of confusion and wanted to share important information while I was still thinking clearly. Children, I need to tell you something crucial about your father's financial arrangements, I began, with the perfect mixture of urgency and mental fragility. What about father's arrangements, Mother? Cordelia asked, leaning forward with barely contained excitement. Edgar was much more clever about security than any of us realized. He didn't trust banks entirely, you see. He believed in diversifying not just investments, but storage locations. Storage locations for what, Mother? For the truly valuable pieces, of course. The items that couldn't be replaced if something happened to our traditional financial institutions. I paused dramatically, allowing my children to absorb the implication that there were valuable assets hidden somewhere on the property. Edgar created what did he call it? A treasure map of sorts. But not a paper map, you understand. A landscape map. He said that intelligent people could read the messages he'd left in the garden design. Jasper's eyes were now gleaming with the intensity of a professional accountant who'd discovered a new tax loophole. Mother, what kind of messages in the garden design? Patterns, dear boy. Plantings that indicated locations, stones that marked specific spots. Edgar said that someone who truly understood our property would be able to interpret the signs he'd left. Did Father leave any other clues about these locations? Felix asked with forced casualness. Oh yes, but they're quite cryptic. He mentioned something about following the roses to the true treasure and counting stones from the heart of the garden. Edgar always loved puzzles, you know. I watched my children exchange glances, clearly struggling to process this information while maintaining appropriate expressions of concern for their mother's mental state. Mother, perhaps we should help you look for these garden clues, Cordelia suggested. It might be good exercise for you to walk around the property. What a thoughtful suggestion, but we'll need to be very systematic about it. Edgar always said that treasure hunting required patience and careful observation. That night, Winston's surveillance cameras captured the most entertaining footage yet. All 3 of my children returned to my house after midnight, armed with flashlights and small garden tools, conducting covert excavations in my rose garden. Mrs. Hawthorne, they worked until nearly 3 a.m. digging small holes around your property, Winston reported the next morning. They were very careful to replace the soil and restore the appearance of undisturbed ground. How thoughtful of them to be so neat about their treasure hunting. Did they find anything interesting? Only earthworms and confusion, I suspect. Phase 5 was exceeding my expectations for both entertainment value and character revelation. My children's willingness to spend their nights grave-robbing their dying mother's garden demonstrated a level of greed that was almost impressively shameless. But Phase 6 would test the absolute limits of their desperation and reveal exactly how far they were willing to go to secure their inheritance. I could hardly wait to introduce them to my final wishes about a proper funeral service. Some treasure hunts led to buried gold. This treasure hunt was going to lead to buried dignity, specifically my children's dignity, which they were about to bury themselves through their own choices. Phase 6 required me to embrace my inner drama queen more completely than I'd ever imagined possible. The centerpiece of this phase was what I privately called the Living Funeral Spectacular, a plan so audacious that even Winston raised his eyebrows when I explained it to him. Mrs. Hawthorne, you want to stage your own funeral while you're still alive? Precisely, Winston. I want to experience the joy of hearing what people truly think about me before I'm actually gone. And more importantly, I want to observe how my children behave during what they believe are my final arrangements. The plan required elaborate coordination. I would convince my children that I was experiencing rapid decline and wanted to plan my own funeral service to ensure it reflected my wishes. Then, I would fake my death for 24 hours and observe their behavior from a hidden location while they organized my memorial service. Winston, this will require your most sophisticated surveillance equipment and possibly some theatrical magic. Mrs. Hawthorne, I have to ask, are you certain this plan isn't somewhat extreme? Winston, my children have spent the past month digging holes in my garden looking for buried treasure because they think their dying mother has lost her mind. I think extreme circumstances call for extreme documentation. Phase 6 began with me calling each child separately to explain my deteriorating condition. Jasper, darling, I'm afraid my health has taken a rather dramatic turn, I said in my weakest, most fragile voice. Dr. Pemberton says the timeline has accelerated significantly. Accelerated? What does that mean, Mother? It means weeks rather than months, dear. Perhaps days rather than weeks. Which is why I've made a rather unusual decision about my funeral arrangements. Funeral arrangements? I want to plan my own service, Jasper. I want to ensure that everything reflects my true wishes and that the people I care about have the opportunity to share their memories while I can still appreciate them. Mother, you're talking about planning your own funeral while you're still alive? Exactly. Wouldn't it be wonderful to hear the lovely things people say about me instead of missing all the kind words because I'm dead? I've already contacted Reverend Whitmore about holding the service this Saturday at 2 p.m. I could hear Jasper struggling to process this information while trying to sound supportive of his mother's final wishes. Mother, that's a very unique idea. I thought so too. And Jasper, I've decided that I want the service to include readings of my will so everyone can understand how I've chosen to distribute my earthly possessions. It will be like Christmas and a funeral combined. The horror in Jasper's voice was absolutely delicious. You're going to read your will at your own funeral? Well, obviously I won't be reading it personally, dear. I'll be in the casket, listening. But I've asked my attorney to present the final version to all the beneficiaries during the service. My calls to Cordelia and Felix followed similar patterns, each conversation ending with their reluctant agreement to attend their mother's living funeral while clearly panicking about the public reading of my will. What my children didn't know was that I'd spent considerable time crafting a completely fictional will that would shock everyone in attendance, a will that left my entire estate to my devoted caregiver, Violet Pennyworth, in recognition of her exceptional compassion during my final months. On Friday evening, I staged my final decline by calling each child to say goodbye. Cordelia, dear, I wanted to call while I still have the strength. I'm afraid tonight might be my last. Mother, no. Are you certain? Should I come over immediately? No, darling. Violet is here taking excellent care of me. I just wanted to tell you how much I've loved being your mother and how proud I am of the woman you've become. Mother, I love you too. I'm sorry if I haven't been more attentive during your illness. Nonsense, dear. You've been exactly as attentive as your character allows you to be. Saturday morning brought the pièce de résistance. Violet called each of my children to inform them that I had passed peacefully in my sleep, and that, per my final wishes, the funeral service would proceed as planned that afternoon. Winston had arranged for me to hide in the church balcony, behind heavy curtains that concealed the choir loft, with a perfect view of the proceedings and high-quality audio equipment to record everything. At 2 p.m. sharp, I watched my children enter St. Michael's Church dressed in appropriately somber black clothing, their faces carrying expressions of grief that looked convincing to casual observers, but which I recognized as carefully performed sorrow. The turnout was impressive. My neighbors, former employees from my florist shops, members of my garden club, and various community acquaintances filled the pews to pay their respects to Beatrice Hawthorne. Reverend Whitmore delivered a lovely eulogy about my contributions to the community and my devotion to family, while I listened from my hiding place, feeling rather pleased with how well regarded I apparently was among people who weren't related to me. Then came the moment I'd been anticipating with delicious excitement, the reading of my final will and testament by my attorney, Mr. Pemberton. Per Mrs. Hawthorne's explicit final wishes, I will now read the distribution of her estate, Mr. Pemberton announced to the assembled mourners. I watched my children lean forward with barely concealed anticipation, finally about to learn the true contents of my will after months of speculation and treasure hunting. I, Beatrice Hawthorne, being of sound mind and body, leave my entire estate, including all properties, investments, and personal possessions, to Miss Violet Pennyworth in recognition of her exceptional care and genuine compassion during my final months. The silence in the church was so complete, you could have heard a pin drop. I watched my children's faces transform from anticipation to confusion to absolute horror as they processed the reality that their expected inheritance had been left to a woman they'd known for less than 2 weeks. To my children Jasper, Cordelia, and Felix, I leave my profound disappointment in their behavior during my illness and the knowledge that they revealed their true character when they believed no one would be alive to remember their choices. Cordelia actually gasped audibly, while Jasper's face turned an interesting shade of purple. Felix looked like he might faint, but the best part was yet to come. As the congregation sat in stunned silence, processing this unexpected will reading, I prepared to make my grand entrance and deliver the surprise of their lifetimes. Some funeral services ended with peaceful prayers and quiet reflection. This funeral service was about to end with the dead woman walking out of her own casket to confront the people who'd been celebrating her demise. The moment had arrived for the most spectacular entrance of my 72 years on this earth. I waited until the shocked murmurs from the will reading had died down to a confused whisper before making my move. Winston, positioned near the church sound system, gave me the prearranged signal that all recording equipment was functioning perfectly. I stood up in the choir loft and began my descent down the narrow staircase that led to the main sanctuary, each step carefully timed for maximum dramatic impact. The first person to notice me was little Tommy Henderson from across the street, whose 7-year-old eyes went wide as saucers when he spotted the supposedly dead woman walking down the church stairs. "Mommy," Tommy whispered loudly. "Mrs. Hawthorne isn't dead anymore." The ripple of awareness spread through the congregation like wildfire. Heads turned, mouths dropped open, and several elderly ladies from my garden club actually clutched their pearls in genuine shock. But no one was more thunderstruck than my 3 children, who watched their supposedly deceased mother approach the pulpit with expressions of horror that no amount of acting could have produced. "Good afternoon, everyone," I said pleasantly into the microphone, adjusting it to my height with the casual confidence of someone who wasn't supposed to be breathing. "Thank you all for attending my funeral. I must say the turnout exceeded my expectations. The silence in the church was so profound, I could hear the old building settling. Even Reverend Whitmore appeared to be questioning his theological understanding of resurrection. I imagine you're all somewhat surprised to see me walking around, given that I supposedly passed away last night. Well, I have some wonderful news to share with you all. Dr. Pemberton called 6 months ago to inform me that my terminal diagnosis was a medical error. I'm completely healthy and expect to live for many more years." The congregation's collective intake of breath was audible. Mrs. Peterson from the garden club actually fanned herself with her funeral program, while my neighbor Mr. Crawford removed his hat and scratched his head in bewilderment. Now, you might be wondering why I didn't correct this misunderstanding immediately. Well, that's where things become quite interesting. I turned to face my children directly, noting that Jasper had gone pale. Cordelia was gripping the pew in front of her with white knuckles, and Felix looked like he was contemplating escape routes. You see, when I learned about my misdiagnosis, I realized I had a unique opportunity to observe how certain people behaved when they believed I was dying. What I discovered was illuminating. I gestured to Winston, who activated the large screen we'd installed at the front of the church. The first video clip began playing, showing Jasper, Cordelia, and Felix in my living room discussing the division of my jewelry and properties. This footage was taken 1 week after my supposed terminal diagnosis, I explained to the increasingly riveted audience. As you can see, my children weren't exactly devastated by the news of my approaching demise. The audio was crystal clear. The jewelry alone is worth at least $200,000. We need to be strategic about the property division. The important thing is that we handle this division equitably. I watched my children sink lower in their seats as their own voices filled the church, discussing my assets with the enthusiasm of game show contestants calculating their potential winnings. But wait, there's more, I announced with the cheerful energy of a television host. The screen now showed footage of all 3 children digging holes in my garden at midnight, flashlights bobbing as they searched for the imaginary treasures I'd convinced them Edgar had buried. The congregation was now openly staring at my children with expressions ranging from shock to barely suppressed amusement. Mrs. Fernandez covered her mouth to hide what appeared to be a smile, while young Tommy Henderson pointed excitedly at the screen. "Look, Mommy! They're playing in the dirt like puppies." Over the past 6 months, I continued, I conducted what I call a comprehensive character assessment. I observed how my children responded to my supposed terminal illness, how they prioritized their inheritance over my well-being, and how far they were willing to go to secure assets they believed were rightfully theirs. The next video clip showed Jasper consulting with estate attorneys about challenging the mental capacity of terminally ill patients, followed by footage of Cordelia researching jewelry auction houses, and Felix contacting real estate agents about property valuations. As you can all see, my children spent my final months preparing for my death rather than cherishing our remaining time together. They stopped visiting, stopped calling, and started calculating. Cordelia finally found her voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper. "Mother, we can explain." "Oh, darling, no explanation is necessary. Your behavior over the past 6 months has been explanation enough." I gestured for Winston to bring out the final surprise, a cart containing actual legal documents, which brings us to the real will reading. You see, the document Mr. Pemberton just read was completely fictional, designed to gauge your reactions to losing your expected inheritance. I could see hope flickering in my children's eyes as they realized there might still be a chance to inherit my assets. However, your behavior during my supposed final months has inspired some very real changes to my actual will. I held up the genuine legal documents, properly notarized and witnessed. My actual will now leaves the majority of my estate to the people who demonstrated genuine care and concern during my supposed illness. My housekeeper Maria, who brought me soup every day and sat with me when she thought I was frightened. My gardener Giuseppe, who offered to maintain my property for free so I wouldn't worry about expenses during my final months. My neighbor Mrs. Chen, who organized meal deliveries from other community members. As for my children, I continued, watching their faces cycle through hope, anxiety, and growing dread, you'll each receive exactly what your behavior during my supposed final months demonstrated you deserved. I nodded to Winston, who wheeled out 3 wrapped packages. Jasper, since you spent so much time consulting attorneys about my mental capacity, you receive a comprehensive collection of legal textbooks about elder care and family responsibility. Cordelia, since you were so interested in my jewelry collection's monetary value, you receive a lovely set of costume jewelry from the dollar store, sparkly but utterly worthless. And Felix, since you spent so many nights digging holes in my garden, you receive this beautiful new shovel, perfect for continuing your excavation hobby. The church had fallen completely silent, except for what sounded suspiciously like Mrs. Henderson trying to suppress laughter. The remainder of my estate, valued at approximately $2.4 million, will be distributed among the people who showed me genuine kindness when they believed I was dying, and to various charitable organizations that support families dealing with actual terminal illnesses. I set down the legal documents and looked directly at my children. You wanted to know what you were inheriting from me. Well, now you know. You're inheriting the knowledge that your mother lived long enough to see exactly who you really are when you think no one is watching. Some funeral services ended with tears of sorrow. This funeral service was ending with tears of regret from 3 people who had just learned the most expensive lesson of their lives about the difference between loving someone and loving their money. And I was just getting started. The silence in the church stretched for nearly 30 seconds before the congregants began reacting to the spectacle they'd just witnessed. Mrs. Chen, my neighbor, not to be confused with any fictional relatives, stood up and began clapping slowly, soon joined by Giuseppe, Maria, and several other community members who apparently appreciated the poetic justice of my performance. "Brava, Beatrice," called out Mrs. Fernandez from the 3rd pew. "That was better than anything on television." My children, meanwhile, remained frozen in their seats like deer caught in headlights, clearly struggling to process the reality that their expected inheritance had just been redistributed to people they'd barely noticed during my supposed final months. "Now then," I continued from the pulpit, thoroughly enjoying my captive audience. I believe this would be an appropriate time for my children to address the congregation about their behavior during my terminal illness. After all, you've all seen the evidence of their priorities. Jasper was the first to find his voice, though it emerged as a hoarse croak. Mother, this entire situation has been unprecedented. We were grieving and trying to handle practical arrangements during an emotionally devastating time. Grieving? I repeated with raised eyebrows. Jasper, the only thing you were grieving was the possibility that I might donate my assets to charity before you could inherit them. That's not fair, Mother. We were trying to protect your financial interests while we thought you were mentally compromised by your illness. Ah, yes, the mental compromise defense. Winston, would you please show everyone the footage of Jasper consulting with attorneys about having me declared mentally incompetent? The screen displayed audio recordings of Jasper discussing legal strategies for challenging my mental capacity, including his memorable quote, "Terminal patients often make irrational financial decisions that families need to protect them from." Protecting me from irrational decisions, I mused. Like the irrational decision to give my money to charities instead of leaving it to children who were celebrating my approaching death. Cordelia finally stood up, her face flushed with humiliation and anger. Mother, you've humiliated us in front of the entire community. Don't you think this public spectacle is unnecessarily cruel? Unnecessarily cruel? I laughed, a genuine sound of delighted disbelief. Cordelia, you spent 6 months treating your supposedly dying mother like an inconvenient obstacle between you and valuable jewelry. I think a little public accountability is quite necessary. We made mistakes, Felix interjected, finally joining the conversation. But we're your children. Doesn't that count for something? Of course it counts for something, Felix. It counts for disappointment. It counts for heartbreak. It counts for the knowledge that I raised 3 people who could look at their dying mother and see nothing but dollar signs. I walked down from the pulpit and approached their pew, lowering my voice so the congregation had to strain to hear my words. Do you want to know what hurt me most? It wasn't your greed, though that was certainly disappointing. It wasn't even your willingness to have me declared mentally incompetent, though that was breathtakingly callous. I paused, letting them absorb the weight of my words. What hurt most was realizing that you stopped seeing me as a person the moment you learned I was dying. I became inventory to you. Real estate and jewelry and investment portfolios with an inconvenient heartbeat that you had to wait for to stop. The church was so quiet, you could have heard a prayer book drop. Even little Tommy Henderson seemed to understand that something serious was happening. Mother, Jasper said quietly, what would you have had us do differently? The question was so fundamentally obtuse that I actually laughed. Visit me, Jasper. Call me. Ask how I was feeling. Hold my hand. Tell me you loved me. Act like my death would be a loss rather than a windfall. We did love you, Cordelia protested weakly. No, darling. You loved my money. You tolerated me as the temporary guardian of assets you felt entitled to inherit. I turned to address the congregation, many of whom were now openly weeping, though I suspected their tears were more from laughter than sorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to meet the people who did show me love during my supposed final months. Maria stood up, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. Mrs. Hawthorne was never dying to me. She was living, and she deserved kindness every day. Giuseppe nodded vigorously. Sick or healthy, Mrs. Hawthorne is good lady. Her children, they only come around when they think she dies soon. Very sad. Mrs. Chen spoke with the practical wisdom of someone who'd observed family dynamics for 8 decades. When people show you who they are, believe them the first time. These children showed exactly who they are when they thought it wouldn't matter. I returned to the pulpit for my closing remarks. I want everyone here to understand that this wasn't just an elaborate prank. This was a 6-month character assessment that revealed fundamental truths about family relationships, love, and greed. I held up the authentic legal documents that would govern the actual distribution of my estate. These documents are legally binding and have been properly filed with the probate court. My children will receive the symbolic gifts I mentioned, while people who demonstrated genuine character will inherit my actual assets. Furthermore, I continued with particular satisfaction. I've established the Hawthorne Foundation for Terminal Care, which will use the majority of my estate to support families dealing with actual terminal illnesses, families who need help with medical expenses rather than inheritance calculations. The congregation erupted in applause while my children sat in stunned silence, apparently still processing the magnitude of their losses. "Now then," I announced cheerfully, "I believe this concludes our funeral service. Thank you all for attending, and please join me in the fellowship hall for refreshments. I understand there's a lovely cake that was intended for my memorial reception." As people began filing out of the sanctuary, chattering excitedly about the most entertaining funeral service in local history, my children remained seated, staring at their symbolic inheritance gifts. "Mother," Felix said quietly, "what happens now? Now, you learn to live with the consequences of choices you made when you thought no one would be around to hold you accountable. Will you ever forgive us?" Cordelia asked, tears finally flowing down her cheeks. I considered the question carefully, looking at these three people who'd shared my home, my love, and my life for decades, before revealing their true character when they thought it wouldn't matter. Forgiveness is possible, darling. But trust is something that has to be rebuilt from scratch, and you'll need to demonstrate that you learned something from this experience beyond disappointment about losing money you never actually owned. Some family relationships could survive betrayal and greed. Whether ours would survive remained to be seen, but the power dynamics had permanently shifted in ways that would make any future relationship much more honest about everyone's true motivations. And honestly, I was rather looking forward to the challenge. 6 months after what had become locally known as the Hawthorne Funeral Spectacular, I was enjoying my morning coffee in the sunroom when Jasper's car pulled into my driveway. This marked his 15th attempt to visit me since the church incident, though I'd only agreed to see him 3 times, each meeting lasting exactly 15 minutes. "Good morning, Mother," Jasper said when I opened the door, holding a bouquet of daisies that looked like he'd picked them up at the grocery store. "I brought these for your garden." "How thoughtful, dear. Though you do realize I have a professional gardener who handles the flower arrangements? I thought perhaps we could plant them together, as a gesture of rebuilding our relationship." I studied my eldest son, noting that the past 6 months had aged him considerably. Word of his behavior during my terminal illness had spread through our small community with the efficiency of a high-speed internet connection, and his accounting practice had lost several prominent clients who found his character lacking. "Jasper, you may come in for precisely 20 minutes. Giuseppe is coming at 10 to discuss the spring planting schedule for the memorial garden." "Memorial garden?" "Yes, dear. I've created a lovely space dedicated to Edgar's memory, funded by the money you thought you'd inherit. It features a meditation area where people can reflect on the difference between genuine love and financial opportunism." Jasper winced at the pointed reminder of his inheritance expectations, but followed me into the living room, which I'd completely redecorated since discovering my children's true character. Gone were the family photographs that had once dominated the space, replaced by artwork created by local artists whose work I'd commissioned with my inheritance money. "Mother, I've been attending counseling sessions to understand why I reacted so poorly to your diagnosis. And what have you learned from these sessions?" "I've learned that I allowed financial anxiety to override emotional priorities, and that I treated you like a business transaction rather than my mother." "That's a remarkably accurate assessment, Jasper. What else have you learned?" "I've learned that my behavior during your supposed final months revealed character flaws that I need to address if I want to have any meaningful relationships with family or anyone else." I sipped my coffee thoughtfully, noting that Jasper's language suggested genuine self-reflection rather than the performative remorse he demonstrated immediately after the funeral incident. "Jasper, what would you do differently if you could replay the past 6 months?" "I would visit you daily. I would ask about your comfort and emotional needs. I would spend time reminiscing about family memories instead of calculating asset values." "And what have you done to demonstrate that these aren't just words designed to manipulate me into changing my will?" Jasper reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small notebook, which he handed to me with obvious nervousness. "I've been volunteering at Sunset Manor, the assisted living facility downtown. This notebook contains thank you letters from residents whose families have stopped visiting them. I opened the notebook and found dozens of handwritten notes expressing gratitude for Jasper's weekly visits, his help with correspondence, and his assistance with practical tasks that family members had abandoned. Mrs. Rodriguez wrote that note after I helped her organize photographs of her grandchildren who haven't visited her in 2 years, Jasper explained. Mr. Thompson wrote that one after I spent an afternoon listening to stories about his military service that his children find boring. I read several of the letters, recognizing genuine appreciation from elderly people who'd been forgotten by their own families. Jasper, what motivated you to begin this volunteer work? I realized that my behavior toward you was probably reflective of how I treated other people in my life. I wanted to understand what it felt like to give care without expecting anything in return. And what have you learned from that experience? I've learned that spending time with people purely because they deserve companionship and respect is more fulfilling than any financial transaction I've ever handled. I studied Jasper's face, looking for signs of manipulation or performance, but his expressions suggested genuine emotional growth rather than calculated remorse. Jasper, your volunteer work demonstrates character development that I hadn't expected to see from you. Mother, I understand that I destroyed your trust, and that rebuilding it will require consistent action over time. I'm not asking for immediate forgiveness or changes to your will. I'm asking for the opportunity to prove that I learned something valuable from the most humiliating experience of my life. Our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Cordelia, who'd been making similar attempts to rebuild our relationship through actions rather than just apologies. Hello, Mother. Hello, Jasper. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Actually, Cordelia, you're perfectly timed. I was just learning about Jasper's volunteer work at Sunset Manor. Cordelia's expression brightened slightly. That's wonderful, Jasper. I've been doing something similar at the Children's Hospital, reading stories to young patients whose families can't visit during treatment sessions. I felt surprised by this development. Cordelia, when did you begin hospital volunteer work? 3 months ago. I realized that your supposed terminal illness taught me something important about what really matters when people are facing health crises. And what did it teach you? It taught me that sick people need presence and emotional support, not people calculating their practical value. Mother, when I thought you were dying, I should have been reading to you, not researching jewelry appraisals. Giuseppe arrived precisely at 10 a.m., as he always did, carrying plans for the spring Memorial Garden expansion. He greeted Jasper and Cordelia politely, but without enthusiasm, clearly remembering their behavior during my final months. Mrs. Hawthorne, we have beautiful location for new meditation bench, right next to roses that bloom all season. Very peaceful spot for thinking about real love versus fake love. Giuseppe's English wasn't perfect, but his meaning was crystal clear. He'd observed my children's transformation attempts with the skepticism of someone who understood that actions mattered more than words. Giuseppe, my children have been telling me about their volunteer work with elderly people and sick children. Volunteer work is good, Giuseppe said diplomatically, but volunteer work after shame is different from volunteer work from heart. Time will show which kind they do. I realized that Giuseppe had articulated exactly what I'd been thinking about my children's rehabilitation efforts. Were they volunteering because they'd learned valuable lessons about compassion? Or were they volunteering because community service might eventually restore their access to my inheritance? Jasper, Cordelia, Giuseppe raises an important point about motivation. How do I distinguish between genuine character growth and strategic behavior designed to restore your positions in my will? You observe us over time, Cordelia said simply. You watch whether we continue these efforts after you've made it clear that your will won't be changed regardless of our behavior. And Mother, Jasper added, you judge us by whether we're doing this work because we want to become better people, or because we want to regain access to money we never actually owned. Some children learned lessons through easy teaching and gentle guidance. My children were learning lessons through public humiliation and complete loss of financial expectations. Whether those lessons would stick remained to be seen, but their current efforts suggested that sometimes the most expensive education produced the most lasting results. 1 year after my resurrection from the dead, I was hosting the first annual Hawthorne Foundation Gala in the ballroom of the Riverside Hotel, surrounded by community members who'd contributed to supporting families dealing with terminal illnesses. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was celebrating a charity built on money my children had expected to inherit while they served as volunteer waitstaff for the evening. Mrs. Hawthorne, the silent auction has raised over $40,000, Maria announced, approaching me with obvious pride in her new role as foundation director. The bidding for Giuseppe's garden design services has been particularly competitive. I looked across the ballroom at Giuseppe, who was explaining his landscaping philosophy to a group of wealthy donors while wearing the first formal suit he'd ever owned, purchased with funds from his inheritance portion. Maria, how are our newest volunteers performing tonight? Maria glanced toward the service area where Jasper was carefully arranging appetizer plates while Cordelia refilled water glasses and Felix helped with coat check duties. They work hard and complain nothing. Very different from before, when they visit only to count your jewelry. The transformation in my children's behavior over the past year had been remarkable to witness. Jasper had not only continued his work at Sunset Manor, but had also started a pro bono accounting service for elderly residents whose families had abandoned their financial responsibilities. Cordelia had expanded her hospital volunteer work to include art therapy sessions for pediatric cancer patients. Felix had begun cooking weekly meals at the homeless shelter using techniques he'd learned during his restaurant management career. Mrs. Hawthorne, a familiar voice interrupted my observations. Dr. Pemberton approached with a champagne glass and an expression of amused admiration. I have to tell you, this past year has been the most entertaining medical experience of my career. I do hope my resurrection didn't damage your professional reputation, Doctor. Quite the opposite. The story of your miraculous recovery has become legendary among medical professionals. We've even incorporated it into ethics training about the importance of accurate test result communication. Dr. Pemberton gestured toward my children, who were working efficiently and cheerfully at their volunteer duties. How do you feel about their rehabilitation progress? I feel cautiously optimistic, though I'm still waiting to see what happens when they realize that their volunteer work won't restore their inheritance status. You haven't told them that their charitable efforts are permanent rather than probationary? Dr. Pemberton, the most important test of character change is how people behave when they believe their efforts aren't being monitored or rewarded. As if summoned by our conversation, Felix approached with a plate of his signature appetizers, which he'd prepared specially for the gala. Mother, the kitchen reports that these salmon canapes are the most popular items tonight. Several guests have asked for the recipe. That's wonderful, Felix. Your culinary skills have certainly enhanced this evening's success. Mother, I wanted to ask you something. Mrs. Chen mentioned that you're planning to expand the foundation services next year. Is there any way I could be more involved in the food service aspects of the programs? I studied Felix's face, looking for signs of financial motivation behind his request for increased involvement. Felix, what kind of involvement did you have in mind? I was thinking about organizing cooking classes for families dealing with terminal illnesses. Many caregivers struggle with maintaining proper nutrition during medical crises, and I could teach simple, healthy meal preparation techniques. That sounds like a valuable service. Felix, would you be interested in this work if it required significant time commitment without any financial compensation? Mother, I've learned that the most meaningful work I've ever done has been the volunteer cooking at the homeless shelter. The satisfaction I get from feeding people who need help is worth more than any restaurant profit I've ever earned. I felt genuinely moved by Felix's response, recognizing what appeared to be authentic personal growth rather than calculated rehabilitation performance. Felix, I think your cooking class proposal has considerable merit. Let's discuss it with Maria next week. Across the ballroom, I noticed Cordelia engaged in animated conversation with several potential donors, showing them photographs of her art therapy work with children at the hospital. These drawings were created by 8-year-old patients during chemotherapy sessions, Cordelia was explaining to the small group. Art therapy helps children process fear and pain in ways that traditional counseling sometimes can't achieve. Cordelia, how did you develop expertise in therapeutic art techniques? Asked Mrs. Fernandez, who'd become one of the foundation's most generous supporters. I spent 6 months training with certified art therapists at the Children's Hospital. I realized that my background in interior design gave me color and composition skills that could be adapted for therapeutic purposes. And you donate this time completely voluntarily? Mrs. Fernandez, this work has given my life more purpose and meaning than any paid design project ever did. These children have taught me that beauty and healing are connected in ways I never understood before. I felt proud listening to Cordelia articulate genuine passion for work that served others rather than herself, though I remained cautiously skeptical about the permanence of her transformation. At 9 p.m., I took the stage to address the gala attendees about the Foundation's first-year accomplishments and future goals. Ladies and gentlemen, when I started this foundation, I wanted to honor people who demonstrate genuine compassion during times of crisis, rather than people who see crisis as opportunity for personal gain. I gestured toward Maria, Giuseppe, and Mrs. Chen, who were seated at the head table as honored guests. These individuals showed me authentic kindness when they believed I was facing terminal illness. They didn't calculate my value as an inheritance opportunity. They saw me as a person deserving care and companionship. Tonight, we celebrate a foundation that has provided support to over 200 families dealing with actual terminal diagnoses, funded through resources that were originally intended for people who proved they didn't deserve them. The audience laughed appreciatively, clearly understanding the reference to my children's behavior during my supposed final months. However, I also want to acknowledge that people can change, that character can be developed, and that redemption is possible for those willing to do the difficult work of examining their priorities. I looked directly at Jasper, Cordelia, and Felix, who had stopped their volunteer duties to listen to my remarks. This past year has demonstrated that some people can learn valuable lessons from humiliating experiences and use those lessons to become genuinely better human beings. Whether that character development is permanent or temporary remains to be seen. But tonight, I'm optimistic about the possibility that 3 people I raised have finally discovered the difference between loving someone and loving their money. The audience applauded enthusiastically while my children exchanged glances that suggested both hope and continued uncertainty about their long-term status in our family relationships. Some rehabilitation projects took months of consistent effort to show results. My children's rehabilitation project was entering its most critical phase, the period when their true motivations would be revealed through choices they made when they thought no one was monitoring their progress. 18 months after my dramatic resurrection, I was sitting in my attorney's office reviewing the final documents that would determine my children's ultimate fate in my estate planning. Mr. Pemberton had become quite fond of our family drama, often remarking that my case had provided more entertainment than his entire previous career in probate law. Mrs. Hawthorne, these revised documents reflect the 18 months of behavioral observation you've conducted since your funeral incident, he said with obvious amusement. Are you satisfied with the decision you've reached about your children's inheritance status? Mr. Pemberton, I've reached a decision that reflects the complexity of human character development rather than simple categories of good and evil. The truth was that my children's behavior over the past 18 months had been genuinely impressive. They'd continued their volunteer work even after I'd made it clear that charity wouldn't restore their inheritance expectations. They'd demonstrated sustained commitment to helping others, and their motivations appeared to be authentic rather than performative. But I had one final test planned, the most important test of all. Mr. Pemberton, I want you to schedule individual meetings with each of my children this week. I want to tell them personally about the final changes to my will. And what will you be telling them? I'm going to tell them the truth about redemption, forgiveness, and the difference between punishment and education. That Wednesday afternoon, I met with Jasper in the same living room where I'd first overheard his calculations about my jewelry and property values. Jasper, I've asked you here to discuss the final status of your inheritance situation. His face carried the careful composure of someone who'd learned to expect disappointment but was still hoping for unexpected reprieve. Mother, whatever you've decided, I want you to know that this past year and a half has taught me more about character and priorities than the previous 45 years of my life combined. And what has it taught you specifically? It's taught me that the only wealth that actually matters is the relationships you build through genuine care for other people's well-being. The volunteer work I've done at Sunset Manor has been more fulfilling than any financial success I've ever achieved. Jasper, what would you do if I told you that your inheritance status remains unchanged, that you'll still receive only the legal textbooks I gave you at the church? He was quiet for several minutes, apparently considering his answer carefully. I would be disappointed, because I'd hoped to earn back your trust. But I would continue the volunteer work at Sunset Manor and the pro bono accounting services because that work has become important to me for reasons that have nothing to do with inheritance expectations. And if I told you that I was restoring a portion of your inheritance in recognition of your character development, I would be grateful for your forgiveness, but I would also be concerned about whether receiving money might tempt me to relax the standards I've set for myself about serving others. I felt genuinely moved by Jasper's response, recognizing wisdom that had been earned through humiliation and sustained effort rather than easy learning. My meetings with Cordelia and Felix followed similar patterns, each conversation revealing mature perspective that had been developed through 18 months of genuine service to vulnerable populations. Mother, the children I work with at the hospital have taught me that love isn't about what you can get from other people. It's about what you can give to them without expecting anything in return, Cordelia explained during her meeting. And what have you learned about yourself through this work? I've learned that my desire for your jewelry was never about the actual pieces. It was about wanting proof that you valued me. But the children I work with have shown me that feeling valued comes from making other people feel valued. Felix's perspective was equally thoughtful. Mother, cooking for people who can't afford restaurant meals has taught me that hospitality is about nourishing people's spirits, not just their bodies. I spent so many years focused on profit margins that I forgot why I started cooking in the first place. On Saturday morning, I gathered all 3 children for our final family meeting about inheritance and forgiveness. Children, you've spent 18 months demonstrating character development that has genuinely impressed me. You've learned valuable lessons about service, compassion, and the difference between loving people and loving their money. They listened carefully, clearly understanding that this conversation would determine their long-term relationship with both me and their financial futures. I've made a decision about my will that reflects both your past behavior and your recent growth. I handed each of them a sealed envelope containing details of their revised inheritance status. Jasper, you will inherit the lake cottage and enough investment funds to support your continued volunteer work without requiring full-time employment. However, this inheritance comes with the legal requirement that you maintain your volunteer commitments at Sunset Manor for the next 10 years. Cordelia, you will inherit the downtown rental property and resources to establish a permanent art therapy program at the Children's Hospital. Your inheritance is conditional on your continued work with pediatric patients. Felix, you will inherit enough assets to open a nonprofit restaurant that provides job training for homeless individuals while serving affordable meals to low-income families. Your inheritance requires you to operate this restaurant personally rather than hiring others to manage it. My children opened their envelopes and read the detailed terms of their conditional inheritances, which provided financial security while ensuring their charitable work would continue indefinitely. These inheritances reflect my belief that you've learned important lessons about character and service, but they also include safeguards to ensure that receiving money doesn't tempt you to abandon the values you've developed. Mother, Jasper said quietly, these conditions assume that we might revert to selfish behavior if we weren't legally required to continue serving others. Exactly, because I love you enough to protect you from your own potential weaknesses, and I love the people you serve enough to ensure their welfare doesn't depend on your sustained good intentions. And what happens to the remainder of your estate? Felix asked. The majority still goes to the Hawthorne Foundation, which will continue supporting families dealing with terminal illnesses, but a portion will fund oversight of your conditional inheritances to ensure compliance with the service requirements. As my children absorbed the terms of their redemption-based inheritances, I felt satisfied that I'd found an appropriate balance between forgiveness and accountability. Children, you wanted to know what you were inheriting from me. Now you know. You're inheriting the opportunity to spend the rest of your lives proving that character change can be permanent rather than temporary. My children stopped visiting me when they thought I had 6 months to live, too busy dividing my jewelry to spend time with their dying mother. So I spent 6 months documenting their greed, then surprised them by rising from my own casket to reveal that some mothers are harder to bury than their children expected. But I also learned that some people can change when they discover that humiliation is an excellent teacher, and that the best inheritances are the ones that require you to keep earning them through service to others every single day. At 73, I was no longer the naive mother who'd assumed her children loved her unconditionally. I was Beatrice Hawthorne, architect of the most elaborate character assessment in family history, and creator of conditional inheritances that would ensure my children spent their lives proving they deserved the second chance I'd given them. Some families were built on blood and obligation. Our family was now built on earned trust, demonstrated character, and the understanding that love without accountability was just enabling dressed up in prettier language. The children I'd raised had finally learned to love their mother more than her money, and that was worth more than any inheritance could have been. The end.